Hello, people. Um, I didn't feel like editing today, so I guess we're going live because then I can just leave this up and I don't have to edit anything. So it's a win-win for me. I'm gonna wait for like people to start joining before I talk about this because I'm gonna have some fringe theories that are probably gonna be like way far out for some people. So I'll wait to get into that, but yeah, basically, like, I realized recently with, like, posting some of the stuff that I've done that's, like, poking fun at being neurodivergent that some people didn't know that I was, so I wanted to talk about that. Um, and also just kinda talk about, like, how that relates to horsemanship and horses, and then also some thoughts that I have on animals and neurodivergency, which is where it's gonna get more fringe and, like, weird, where people are probably gonna be like, "What are you talking about?" So hi, yes, I will be saving this. It'll be in like I usually don't leave it up on my profile grid on Instagram. Oh yeah, FYI, I'm live on YouTube and Instagram, but it'll be saved on YouTube and Instagram, but you have to go into like the IGTV tab. I'm sorry, my chair squeaks, and I'm always paranoid that people are going to like think that I'm like farting on camera, but it's my chair, I swear. Um, but yeah, I realized after posting some of the jokes that I posted about neurodivergency that some people weren't aware that I was. And like I did get diagnosed later in life. So I wanted to talk about that too, because I think that women and like female presenting people are a lot less likely to get diagnosed with being like ADHD or autistic, and it's getting better now, but especially if you're like yeah, like in your 20s or 30s or whatever, like you would have been way less likely to be diagnosed as a child, and I was one of those kids. um so I got diagnosed when I was like 20 or 21. I can't remember which year it was, but it was like 3 or 4 years ago now. And that was honestly like a big turning point in my life because that diagnosis provided for me like a huge explanation of why I struggled with so many of the things that I did. And also why I thought the way that I did, and just like it was validating why I was different, because for years I was just like I felt like I was on the fringes of everything, and like I was like a little puzzle piece that did not quite fit into the picture. Um and that was a really crappy feeling to have because it just made me feel like an outsider, and it made me feel like there was something wrong with me in specific, rather than there being like, oh, like you think differently than people and these are things that you struggle with because your brain is literally built differently and here's why. Um, so when I got that explanation, it cleared up a lot of things for me, and it made it fuck, I got new plants and there's like flies in here now, so that sucks because they just came out of my plants. But so it provided a lot of an explanation for me, and like helped kind of validate some of the feelings that I had, and it made me less ashamed of myself as a result. So then from there I was able to start to really discover like who I actually was as a person, and stop masking and discover what I actually liked and disliked, and like even simple things like wearing the types of clothes that I wanted. Because for a while I was like trying to like I was like a alien in a human suit that was trying to copy what the other normal humans were doing, in order to be like accepted and not treated like a weirdo. So when it came to like fashion and stuff, I even wasn't doing what I wanted to do for those types of things. So yeah, that diagnosis was super validating because also as a child, like I got bullied a lot, like by teachers and also students, but like teachers were mean to me, especially in elementary school. If they found the way that I learned annoying, they didn't like that I doodled on paper, they didn't like that I wouldn't pay attention the whole time. Um, they didn't like how differently like I learned math and stuff, and they didn't like the fact that I was swaying from like the formulas that they were teaching everyone, even if I got the same answer. They didn't like that. So those teachers were mean to me. And then from there, because when you're like a 6-year old, you assume that all the adults around you are right. So when you become an adult from that 6-year old, you take a lot of those views with you, even as you become more mature in your way of thinking, because those are ideals that you've held on to for so long. And in getting a diagnosis, it kind of validated the fact that like those teachers were the ones in the wrong. Like they weren't altering their teaching style at all to suit people who think differently. And instead of like meeting me where I was at, they chose to humiliate me in front of the class, and basically make me feel like the odd one out rather than like accepting the fact that I was just like a different kid. And I think that this is something that a lot of people can relate to if they are neurodivergent, because usually you have at least one story of like at least one specific teacher that just hated you because of who you were. Even if you weren't like a bad kid, but also like the other thing too is that like the bad kids are the ones that need the most help and assistance in the first place. So yeah. But anyways, horses kind of saved me throughout those hard years because they were like a place where like being in the horse world was a place where I felt I belonged more. Like don't get me wrong with like instructors and different teaching styles, like especially in like a clinic setting, like I did get crap from people in the horse world too, where they were really hard on me and weren't necessarily welcoming about people who think differently. But it was less so than in the regular world. So it was like a little bit of a vacation. And I felt like I could relate to the horses more, and it was somewhere where I felt like I belonged. And also with like ADHD where I can't turn my brain off most of the time, it was a place where I could almost like go into a meditative state and just focus on riding the horses and doing what I was doing and not having it be a thing where my brain was going a mile a minute and I was thinking about a bunch of different things. So it was like a safe place for me. And I think that's also why like it was became such a big passion, because it was like a safe place to be. And also like again, this goes back to neurodivergency, like the hyperfixation and like obsessing over certain things and having like that thing that you freaking love. That was something that was me from a very young age, and it was horses, obviously. So I literally got like I like in elementary school, they literally tried to ban me from taking out horse books from the library because they thought I read about horses too much. And like this is the thing. This is also about like I was reading like probably 7 books a week or more. Like I read all of the time. I was reading a lot. Like I read a lot. And yet, despite the fact that I was outperforming the vast majority of children in terms of how many books I was reading, they tried to ban me from taking out the books that I wanted to because they were uncomfortable with the fact that I was always taking them out on the same topic. And this is like the people who are neurodivergent tend to cling to things that like make them comfortable and like that they like and like have their hyperfixations. And it's like one of those things where like if you like something and you're reading and you're showing interest in something that a lot of kids find boring, that's something that should have been supported and welcomed. But it wasn't. So they tried to ban me from taking out the books that I wanted from school. Luckily, my mom's a teacher, so she fought a bunch of these things pretty heavily and advocated for me. And then they didn't manage to get away with all of it, but they tried. So there was a lot of things put in place to essentially just make me feel like a weirdo and make me feel like I didn't belong because of the way that I thought and wanted to do things, and ways to kind of discourage me from essentially being myself. And there was also things where seemingly small interactions would happen, but they would have like a profound impact on me as a person for years to come, where like if I got embarrassed by a person or a teacher, or if they said something that like criticized a part of who I was, it would be like an anxiety that would follow me for years to come in a way that like other children might not have been impacted by. And to be fair, like in addition to the neurodivergency, I was going through a lot of trauma at the same time, so it was probably related to that as well. But it was also the neurodivergency. So anyways, with regards to like horses in the horse world, what I've noticed is that like I think there's a pretty high volume of neurodivergent people in the horse world. Like I think there's a lot of ADHD and autistic people who gravitate towards horses. And I think there's a reason for that, because horses are like they very much live in the moment. They're highly empathetic animals, and they have a very calming presence. Like there's a bunch of studies done on like horses and the influence they have on like autistic kids, and how they can help people with regulating and interacting with the world. And yeah, so there's actually merit there. I don't know exactly why it's the case, but I think that's why people who are neurodivergent might naturally gravitate towards horses and other animals. And also there's the standpoint of like horses don't judge you. They're not going to judge you or make fun of you for being weird and different. They're not going to make you feel the need to mask, and you can just be yourself around them. And I think the same applies to like other types of animals, and that's why neurodivergent people find more comfort in being around animals, because there's no risk of someone trying to make you feel ashamed of who you are and making you feel really embarrassed and self-conscious about yourself, because this is something that I like struggled with for years. So in talking about this, the reason why I want to talk about this more and just be more direct about this is that, one, I think it makes people more comfortable with coming to terms with the fact if they are neurodivergent, it might push people to get diagnosis if they didn't know that they were. They might hear things that are helpful. Two, it makes people feel more heard. And three, I'm hoping it'll help break the stigma and make it less of a thing. Because I've kind of hit the point now in my life where I've gotten really tired of masking. Because the way I see things is that essentially neurodivergent people from day one, they're forced to try to assimilate with neurotypical culture, learn about how neurotypical think and pander to their way of thinking and go out of their way to not cause them discomfort, to behave a certain way so that they are most heard and listened to by neurotypical people. But then when you reverse the roles, the opposite's not happening. Neurotypical people aren't making an effort to understand people who are neurodivergent. And oftentimes they're making fun of them. Like we have all these things where it's like, you shouldn't bully people who are like autistic or neurodivergent. But then if you look at the types of things that people bully each other for, a lot of those are neurodivergent traits. And I think that neurotypical people, whether they realize it or not, they will clock someone as being neurodivergent and different and then respond accordingly. And if someone's way of interacting makes them uncomfortable, then they can kind of lash out and be not nice to them. Like one of the biggest complaints that I had when I first started making videos on YouTube and Instagram was that I would get a lot of comments about like how monotone my voice was, and people would make fun of me for that. And again, that's like a neurodivergent trait. And it's something that they just like didn't need to be pointed out. Like if you don't like the way someone talks, you don't have to listen to what they're saying, but like making fun of someone's voice and like the way that they go about speaking and doing things is just like a not very nice thing to do. No matter the situation. And it's like if you're gonna do that, like do it in a private group chat away from where that person needs to see it. They don't need to see it. But that was like one of the things that people were really like dragging me about in my YouTube videos. So if you go back, like I didn't do as many vlogs where I was like openly talking, and I certainly didn't do as many voiceovers as I did now because I was very self-conscious about that. And that's just like one of many examples of where people would pick out things that were specific to neurodivergency to try to shame me for and just make me feel bad about. And it's happened on a repeated basis. Like there's so many instances of it that I can't even point it out. So like it's just mind blowing to me because like it's so accepted to do highly ableist things to people who are neurodivergent. And then they'll excuse it. So like another example as of recently is that when I'm posting things about horse sciences and like citing studies and whatnot, like I am sharing things matter of factly, and I just say them how they are. Like if the studies found a certain outcome conclusion wise, like I just say that outcome. I don't speak about those things with like emotion in the sense that I'm trying to cater towards people's feelings. I'm just saying things how they are, and a lot of people take that level of directness as being mean. Another thing that I've noticed is that when people disagree with me and I hold my ground. And if I don't think that they're right, I'm not going to entertain their opinion, especially if it's coming from a place of anecdotes and entirely unfounded information. I'm going to hold my ground. People take me having comfort in my opinions and what I have learned and holding that ground. They take that as a personal attack because they personally identify with their opinions to such an extent that they feel personally attacked when someone doesn't validate them. They feel like they are owed my validation or other people's validation. And when it's not given, they try to label you as like a bully. When really, if you look at the core of what is being said, you're talking about concepts. And if someone identifies so closely and personally with a concept that they feel personally attacked when it is not validated by an outside entity, that is not the problem of people who disagree with them. And the same goes to other people. Like people can think that clicker training is total bullshit and that it's stupid and that it doesn't work and whatever they want. They can think whatever they want. I'm not entitled to them agreeing with me. I can think they're wrong. I can say they're wrong. But ultimately, like, if they hold their ground and double down in their belief systems, that's their business. It's not mine. I'll hold my ground in my beliefs, but them choosing not to validate the way that I do things is not going to change the way that I do things. What will change it is if new information arises where I have a reason to kind of change the way that I do things, and I'm reevaluating the way that I do things as a result, because it's like, okay, information has changed. Now I'm going to change the way that I do things with horses because what XYZ has been disproven. But I've noticed that the act of like holding your ground is something that people take as a personal attack. And what I've also noticed is that it's also very specific to women or female presenting people. If you hold your ground as like a straight white man, it's not viewed as aggressive or unkind or rude in the same way as if you're like a woman. And God forbid you're a woman of color who isn't white passing like myself, because that'll be even further used to derail and disvalue your opinion. So yeah, there's all of these different layers that I've been noticing as years passed. And like, I'm really glad I got my diagnosis because it's given me a lot more confidence in being who I am and like supporting my certain belief systems and really just getting a better understanding of myself. Like, it's allowed me to find and become who I am more readily. And I think that's really important. And I also wanted to say too, like, I got my diagnosis from a psychiatrist, but I do think that self-diagnosis is totally valid. One thing that I will say is that a lot of the memes that talk about like ADHD and autistic traits, some of the traits people might identify with even if they're neurotypical, but it's like how frequently those traits occur. That is like the most important part for diagnosis. Like, everyone has certain hyperfixations or gets distracted sometimes or is disorganized sometimes. But if it's not like consuming your life and it's not like an ever present part of your life, it could just be a normal part of being neurotypical. However, I do think that self-diagnosis is totally valid and it's reasonable to do because it's not always super accessible to get a professional diagnosis. And also there is like even stigma amongst medical professionals where they won't diagnose you, or where you need to jump through a lot of hoops to get that diagnosis, and it can be difficult. Like, if you want to be medicated, the diagnosis is kind of important for getting meds because some people do abuse ADHD meds, and that can be a problem. So doctors can be more reluctant to give those out without like an official diagnosis. Um, but like, I think self-diagnosis is a valid part of that, and I think that's something that's important to say, especially in areas where like healthcare isn't super accessible. Like, even in Canada, like, yeah, we have universal healthcare, but like that doesn't include mental health care. There's a few places who have like publicly funded mental health care services, and I went to one of those, so I didn't have to pay, but there's not a lot of those. So like, getting an appointment with a psychiatrist can be very expensive and it's not super accessible. So I do think that it's important to not like gatekeep how people go about getting their diagnosis, because ultimately, even though I got my diagnosis validated by a psychiatrist, essentially what it was just a self-diagnosis, reiterating that back to a medical professional and having them be like, yes, you have ADHD. And yeah, so it was like, I think self-diagnosis is valid because essentially like I did all of the legwork myself, learning about like what the ADHD traits were, taking a bunch of like self-diagnosis like tests, and looking back on like I like the psychiatrist did ask that I like bring some of my like elementary school report cards so that they could read like what some of the struggles that I was having, and like consistently, like every year it's like, Shelby needs to be more organized, Shelby's very disorganized, blah 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 blah, every single year. So there is like proof that it was like a long-standing issue for me. But all that aside, self-diagnosis is totally valid and relevant. And basically what I was trying to get into though is that the way that neurodivergent people tend to speak doesn't always sit well with neurotypical people, and it's flagged as being yeah, like mean. And in some cases it can be, people can be blunt to the point of being mean, but I think that's something as a society we need to get past, is recognizing the fact that like sharing and expressing different opinions and having debates is healthy, and like your value system, like how you value people, shouldn't be contingent on them reaffirming all of your opinions. Like, when I disagree with people on horse things, it doesn't mean I dislike them as a person. if they go out of their way to like devalue me and like personally attack me, I'll probably like them a little bit less. But ultimately, like someone having different training opinions than me, like I don't agree with those opinions necessarily, but it doesn't mean that I'm devaluing them as a person. And holding my ground in that discussion is not a personal attack on them. So I think that's very important. And I think that we need to talk about these things more because it's really damaging and stressful for people to have to mask. And I think that's a really important thing to say. Like this is going to be like a little TMI, but like in high school, I was so anxious all the time that I was like sweating all the time because I was masking so hard that I was so anxious and I was so tired that like I could barely get through a day. And even like after graduating, like there hit a point where I was masking so heavily throughout the day in addition to doing like very physical work that I was like having like 3 naps a day, which is like not normal to do. And it wasn't because I wasn't sleeping enough at night. It was because I was masking so hard and like the inner personal struggle and anxiety was so all consuming and stressful that that I couldn't take it anymore. And like I needed to rest so much because it was so stressful. So I think that like it might seem like nothing to people who don't have to mask, but when you're having to constantly focus on what you're doing and how you interact with people and how they might be judging you and be like hyper aware of that all the time and you're in like a constant state of hypervigilance, it is not healthy and it's also really exhausting. So there needs to be like we need to kind of change the way that we perceive things, and we definitely need to make things like more accessible for people who are neurodivergent and honestly people with all sorts of disabilities, because it's one of those things that until you actually live that life, you're never going to fully understand it, or until you're really close to someone that does, you're never going to fully understand how much accessibility the world is lacking with both mental and physical disabilities. And what just because we're not personally impacted by something doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about it, because like it matters. Like everyone matters. Their ability to access things in life matters, and it shouldn't be where everyone needs to be the same in order to be valued as a person in society. And yeah, like it makes you question yourself all the time when you're having to mask. It's like honestly, it's like chronically, it's like being constantly gaslit by people around you who are like telling you that you're doing things wrong when it's like literally just doing things the way you need to. Like when I was anxious in school, I would stim a lot, right? So I'd be like shaking my knee or I'd be tapping the table or I'd be clicking my pen, and I was always doing something and it would piss people off and they'd be like, stop that. And like I get that it can be kind of annoying, but also like it's kind of the I'm going to bring this back to horses, but it's kind of the same idea as like if you put a cribbing collar on a horse who's cribbing really badly, the collar is suppressing their ability to crib, but it's not treating the stress that is resulting in them needing to crib. So it suppresses this self-soothing mechanism that is cribbing, and it doesn't help them with anything related to the anxiety. So basically they're just now bottling it all up in their bodies and needing to seek a different outlet or find a different way of alleviating that stress. And the same can be said with people who are using stimming to alleviate stress and just be more comfortable. And then there's also the aspect of like food related stuff, like people who like have I go through food hyperfixations, and there's certain things like texturally and that I just really don't like, and there's certain foods that I'll just go off of for a very long time and that I just can't eat. And it's like to the point where sometimes even when I'm really really hungry, if I look and there's no food available that is like what I want, I'm not hungry for it. And people could perceive that as me just being picky and difficult, when really it's not related to that. Like I eat a lot of different food groups, but there's times where, especially when I'm anxious, where I'm not hungry for other things. And the idea of eating something that is not the thing that I think that I want makes me feel physically ill, and I can't eat it. It's like eating cement or like drywall or something, even if the food is good. If it's not what I want in that moment and I'm not feeling the greatest, it is like eating something that's not meant to be eaten. And that's not to be difficult. It's not to make things harder for other people. It's just simply part of like the way that my brain works sometimes. And honestly, so to tie this back to horses and what I was going to say about horses and like other animals, like a conclusion that I've kind of come to, and like I have no research to prove it. I think that this needs to be researched more, but I'm convinced that neurodivergency exists in other species, because I refuse to believe that other species are like such a perfect mold of that species that there's never any deviation in their brain makeup and how they think. I don't think that that's possible. And so the fact that I believe this too, it's kind of made me double down on a lot more of my welfare views, because there's certain horses that are much more resilient than others and can deal with stress much more easily, and can manage stress easily, like more easily, without having really ill effects. But then there's others who are less resilient and who struggle more with other things and who might have more visceral reactions to certain things, and also just like think differently. So I think that neurodivergency for sure exists in other species. I can't prove it. I'll readily admit that, but I just really don't think it's likely that they're all going to have the same type of brain makeup, and there's not going to be any divergencies um, in the way that animals think. And it's kind of changed how I approach horses, because there are some horses who are just like weird, where they don't react at like normally to horse things. And like a lot of times that can come out of trauma, but what we also need to consider is that trauma does change the brain. It literally changes how your brain functions and how it works. So it's a valid reason for an animal or a person behaving differently. So it's altered the way that I go about my horse training, because there are horses that are different. And the fact that you could have like 100 horses that are okay with you training a certain way, but then one that it really like it scares the crap out of it and it's just too much pressure, and they go backwards in their training, it doesn't mean that that horse is the problem. It just means that you have to adopt different ways of approaching the same thing, because I really do think that like their brain divergencies exist in other species. And so when I get like horses who are weird or who are struggling with other things, like after ruling out like pain and like well, you can never completely rule out pain, but after looking into pain and then like addressing like how they live day to day and like all of the important factors, there are certain things where animals just think differently. Like Milo's trauma of being starved as like especially as young as he was in such a developmental stage, it has 100% changed his brain and changes the way that he thinks. And he's never going to think like a normal horse who has not had that amount of trauma. And it is of benefit, because if he did just like lose all of that, if he were to be starved again, he'd be less resilient. So it's like a safety mechanism that he's developed for himself, where his brain and his behavior has changed in accordance with like the stress that he experienced. So like I think that that's an important thing that people need to consider in training. Like, and also the other thing is that you don't necessarily know what trauma a horse has been through or like what their life has been like unless you've literally raised them their whole life. And honestly, even then, people can downplay how traumatic something is for the horse. And ultimately, it is the learner that decides what is and isn't traumatic, what is and isn't scary, not the teacher. Because again, like as someone who is bullied by teachers and who has been a neurodivergent person, there is stuff that teachers said I had no reason to be upset about or stressed about or find anxiety inducing, but it didn't change the fact that I was anxious. And we do that to horses all the time. So I think what's important is to just like validate whatever their feelings are in the moment without having to know what happened to them. Because the same goes for people. Like if you meet a neurodivergent person, they really shouldn't have to tell you, hey, by the way, I have ADHD, or hey, by the way, I'm autistic, for you to not be a dick to them and for you to be understanding. They shouldn't need to tell you that. And the fact that that's a thing where it's something that you need to like say is a problem, because it's like you're not going to get understood unless you go out of your way to disclose information about yourself that at its core you shouldn't have to say. The reason why I do talk about these things, the reason why I want to disclose them, is because I think it's important for destigmatizing neurodivergency. But I shouldn't have to tell people I'm neurodivergent to like help them understand why I talk the way I do or why I am the way that I am. It shouldn't be something like that. We should just be like accepting of people thinking different ways rather than having like this cookie cutter mold that people need to fit. Because I'm also convinced that a lot of people are neurodivergent, whether they realize it themselves or not. And the society's structure that we have set up makes people feel like they need to fit in a specific mold, whether or not it serves them. And then that causes people a lot of stress that is completely unnecessary and that doesn't need to happen. And then in turn, we go and do the same thing to horses, where we expect them to fit in this cookie cutter mold where they all think the same way and they all respond to things the same way, and that they all should be like meeting certain milestones at specific ages. And be able to do certain things, and it's not the case. Like, that's also why I have such an issue with like the age related classes, because I don't think it's reasonable to expect every horse to hit specific milestones at certain ages, even if the demands of the classes were reasonable, which I don't think that they are. And that is a hill I'll die on. So we just need to change how we perceive things, like, honestly. And like, I think that a good way of doing that is just considering the fact that whether you know it or not, like, your horse could be thinking very differently. They could have a completely different brain. They could be neurodivergent. Like, I have had some horses where I'm sure that they're on the spectrum. Can't prove it, but with their behavior, I'm like, you're like, because even socially with other horses, they're just a little bit different. So whether it's a trauma response or there's something actually different in the makeup of their brain, I have encountered horses where I'm like, you're just like a little socially different, not in a bad way, but they're different, and the other horses even notice it. And it can make them harder to introduce into herds. Even if they've been well socialized since being young, it can be a thing. Like, I've noticed that with Pogo, for example. And he's a very friendly horse. He's friends with everybody, but he misses social cues sometimes, despite the fact that he has always lived in a herd since he was a baby. So I'm pretty sure like Pogo is like an autistic horse. And like, I'm careful saying that because, again, if you're not like, hey, I'm neurodivergent, people use neurodivergent traits and also labels as insults all the time. So then when you use that label, a lot of people are likely to think that you're using it as an insult when that's not the case whatsoever, just because some people do. And it shouldn't be used as an insult. It's the same thing with like any type of mental disorder of any sort. Using it as a descriptor for something when you do not have that disorder is a problem. Like, a lot of people do it with OCD. If you've ever had OCD or anything that's OCD adjacent, because there's ADHD traits that can be kind of on the cusp of being like OCD. Like I had some OCD traits as a kid where I'd get like obsessive with things and I would have compulsions, and if I didn't follow through with them, I'd get really stressed. If you've ever actually had that, it sucks. It's not fun. It's really anxiety inducing, and it's not just some funny, cute, trendy way to be like, I'm so organized, because that's not what it is. It's like intrusive thoughts that are really disturbing that you don't want to think about, and then also potentially subsequent compulsions that you feel the need to engage in so that bad things don't happen to you or your family. It's not fun. It's not just having a clean house. So we need to be careful what traits we use to describe certain things, and if they're not ours to reclaim, we shouldn't be using them. Like, if you're actually neurodivergent, then it's like, by all means, talk about being ADHD, or be like, haha, I'm so ADHD, because you actually are. But using it in a way that's out of context isn't helpful. And that also like made it harder for me to realize that I even had ADHD, because of the way it was portrayed in the media and the stereotypes about ADHD that were normalized, such as like it being there, it's like, oh, a squirrel, like, where it's like really like the way that you see what ADHD is in most like cartoons and movies and like just over the media, especially in years past, it portrays it as something completely different than it is. There's some traits that might be similar to what it is, but it's portrayed so differently that I had no idea what it was like. And then it makes it harder for people to get diagnosis, because they just assume that there's no, like, it literally did not even cross my mind that I possibly could have ADHD until I started like seeing people sharing information about it on social media, and then really like a few of them would pique my interest and I'd follow those accounts, and then more was said and I was like, whoa, what the hell? Because my understanding of it was from like what I saw in the media, and it was totally inaccurate. So this is why it's harmful to spread like stigma that like isn't even remotely close to being true, just for like enjoyment. And there's always different descriptors that you can use to get the point across. Like, you could be like, I'm so scatterbrained today. Like, I'm so all over the place today. I can't focus on anything today. Like, you don't need to use a diagnosis that you don't have to describe something. This is kind of going off topic with being neurodivergent, but I've also mentioned this to people in the horse world for other things. And I'm just going to really briefly mention this because it's a pet peeve of mine. And it's also one of those things where if you've not experienced this yourself, or if you've not been close to someone who has, you don't get it. And I can see how it can go over people's heads. But the same thing is like when people are posting things about their horses acting like scattered and reactive, and they're like, oh, ha, 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 like he has such crackhead energy. That's not cool. It's stigmatizing addiction. Crackheads like are people. And that is like a really nasty way of wording it. And I've also seen people share videos of people who are on drugs and are having like a mental breakdown on social media as a joke. They're still people. They're people. It's not cool to do. It's stigmatizing addiction, and it makes it harder for people like that to seek help. So do not do that. You could say, my horse was being so silly today. My horse was being such a goofy goofball today. You don't need to use something that stigmatizes something that is a mental health problem. And that is what addiction is. So I hate that. It's like the new trend. Before there was like this meme, like back in the day, there was a meme where people are like, haha, horseback riding is like as addictive as cocaine and twice as expensive. And I was like, that is tacky as hell. And that's also once again stigmatizing addiction and using it as like a buzzword to like have like a trendy saying for no reason. And I don't say this to ruin people's fun, because like before I've had people be like, oh, like you can't take a joke, but it's like, that's not a funny joke. The reason why I'm not going to accept jokes that are harmful to already stigmatized groups of people that have a hard time being understood and seeking help, the reason why I won't buy into jokes like that is because there's ways to be funny that are not harmful to marginalized groups of people. It is not funny to turn people who are struggling with a mental health disorder into a caricature. And the same applies to like anyone with neurodivergency. Like if you're using being autistic as like a slur and you're using it to insult people and essentially like make fun of them, that's not okay. You're turning something you don't struggle with into a funny saying that you could use so many other descriptors to replace that are far more accurate and aren't about making fun of someone and turning them into a caricature. And it happens a lot in the horse world, and I think that part of it's the fact that this is like a highly privileged industry where a lot of people who are involved in it have grown up in like a certain level of privilege. And that's not to say that you guys don't work hard, because also like I have privilege as well. It's not to say that you don't work hard, but if you've never been exposed to certain types of issues, that is a privilege in itself. And it results in people making jokes that are harmful to certain groups. Like anyone who has had addiction in their family or who has loved someone with an addiction can probably attest to how shitty that is to go through, how little help there is for people like that, and how difficult it is for like everyone involved, especially the person experiencing the addiction. So anyways, that was a little bit of a tangent, but like be careful the descriptors that you use. And this will also kind of be a good segue into like why some of the jokes that people make about horses are not funny to me, because at its core, it is about stigmatizing behavior that is uncomfortable and harmful to the horse, like with stress behaviors with horses. Making jokes about stress behaviors and laughing them off not only is telling people that these are not stress behaviors and that it's just a funny quirk, it's also like taking away like the serious nature of that discussion. Like we should be talking about things accurately, and if we don't, it perpetuates mindsets that cause further harm, and that is just the fact of the matter. And I don't say that to ruin anyone's fun, but like if you're watching a horse weave in their stall and then you put the video to music and you're like, haha, look, like he's dancing, people who don't know better look at that and they assume that's actually what the case is. You never see any of these types of jokes followed up by disclaimers that are like, disclaimer, I'm just joking. This is actually a stress behavior. And perhaps if they were followed up by things like that, it would be like less bad, but no one's going to do that because they think it would be less funny. And it would make it a lot less funny because people would go, wow, that's a stressed horse. I don't really feel like laughing anymore because that horse is not having a good time. So like the words that we use matter, and how we refer to things does matter, and like what we laugh at and turn into jokes does matter, because a lot of times there's a lot of jokes that are reliant on essentially punching down and poking fun at people who are already marginalized and stigmatized in ways that the people making the jokes cannot even fathom. And then it results in them not being heard, their needs not being met to the degree that they should, and it perpetuates further harmful attitudes that don't need to exist. Um, and yeah, like to kind of try to sum this up, like growing up without being diagnosed with ADHD and with being a neurodivergent person that was often surrounded by neurotypical people, I know how it feels to be the butt of a joke and have everyone around you laughing, even if they don't necessarily think it's funny in the moment. They'll like participate rather than calling it out and advocate for you. I know how it feels to be put in a situation where you feel deeply hurt by what's going on, and it's damaging to you for years to come, and it's traumatic, and no one stands up for you. I know how that feels because it's happened to me a lot over the years. And also people still do it to me. But now that I've gotten older, what I do is for my own mental health is when people are just dragging me online and personally attacking me and just talking about how much they hate me, like I don't look at it anymore because it's like, why would I do that to myself? That's a them problem if they're thinking about me that much. That's weird. But like since that's the case, and I know how it feels like with the horses not being heard, and in an even worse way because they can't just like walk out of the room or go off to social media and escape from what's happening to them. They're kind of along for the ride regardless of whether they want to be or not. And there are situations for sure that humans can't escape from easily either, so that's relevant. But like the reason I think why I've gotten so loud about horse welfare is because, quite frankly, like I don't really care about making people who have the privilege of autonomy, at least like to some extent, they have the privilege of autonomy and they have the ability to advocate for themselves. They have a voice. I don't really care about pandering to their comfort level and what they want to see when they do not have to watch my content. When the flip side is that in order to do that, I would have to completely ignore the issues in the sport and not advocate for horses who cannot speak for themselves, who cannot go on social media and air their grievances and help educate people or at least help make people more aware. They can't do that. And the same thing applies with like neurodivergency stuff. Like I've hit the point now where it's like, I don't really care if my content is less palatable to people who want to poke fun at things that are not funny and who don't like having these things brought to their attention. Like I don't care if they don't like my content. It's not for you. I would rather use my content to make people who are in marginalized groups where they're usually not treated as nicely feel more comfortable. I would rather use my content to be like dismantling stigmas that don't need to exist. And I don't really care about upholding the structures of society that are at their core about like devaluing certain groups of people. So like in short, like this is, and it's also the same thing. Like every time I post something, it's like about like racial equality or something, I usually get at least one message from some person who's like, oh, like, why are you posting about politics on your horse page? To me, basic human decency is not political. It's literally just not being a shitty person. Caring about people of color, even if you are white, basic human decency. It's not politics. Um, and it's something that people get made uncomfortable about, and then they make their discomfort my problem, when at their core their discomfort is that I don't want to hear about these bad things that are happening and how my apathy or my direct actions makes people who are marginalized feel. And it's like, okay, sucks to you, don't watch my content then. There's a million other creators that people can watch that are neurotypical, that are not biracial, and that do not talk about the stuff that I talk about. There's tons of there's more of them than there are not. So kind of where I've gotten to in like my journey of self-discovery is I'm just like, don't watch my content then. If it doesn't resonate with you, it's not my job to devalue myself and betray myself in order to make other people comfortable. Especially when I'm not doing anything wrong. Like it's not wrong to talk about humanitarian issues. It's not wrong to talk about neurodivergency. It's not wrong to talk about horse stress studies and talk about how there's a massive problem in the industry. None of those things are wrong. I can objectively prove that all of those things exist, right? And I've noticed how talking about these things has made people who have previously felt ignored by society feel heard. And I think that is a lot more valuable than making people who feel entitled to comfort in society, even at the cost of other people's well-being, making those people feel comfortable. I would rather make the voiceless and those who feel like their voice has been extinguished feel heard at the expense of comfortable people's discomfort than leave people in groups where they have been not represented, not heard, not cared about as much, in situations where they're not being advocated for and where they're not being heard and where they're not allowed to kind of talk about their grievances. And that's kind of where I stand with the horse world, because like there's stuff that it's like, yeah, it's nice to be comfortable and kind of in denial about what goes on in the horse world. And like, I'll be completely honest, like learning some of the stuff I have done that I have has made it less fun to exist in the horse world. It's made it less fun to go to shows. It's made it less fun to like watch horse videos, because I'll see them for what they are now, rather than looking at it through the lens of like, haha, this is so funny. When the video is of like an exceptionally stressed horse. So it's robbed me of like the ignorant bliss that was being able to ignore all those things and just find fun in them. But it has brought me so much more in return, because I've been able to be more compassionate and kind towards my own horses. It's benefited our relationship. It's changed how I approach the horse world. It's changed how I approach horse training and made it way lower stress and way more comfortable. And it's taught me kind of how to come home to myself and find who I am as a person. So like, for the losses that I have had from altering the way that I think, there's been so much to gain. And in turn, like, I've been able to resonate with people who've kind of felt like they're stuck in a situation where they're on the fringes and where they don't feel like they belong and they don't feel heard, and just something constantly feels off. And then you can be chronically anxious as a result, because like, hello, I've been there. So yeah, that's kind of where I want to go with my content. And like, I hope that like even people who don't necessarily experience some of the stuff that I talk about, like I hope that the people who don't necessarily directly find involvement in the issues that I talk about will at least be open to hearing them. Because what I also find is the people who are the most removed from issues that impact certain populations, like they are the ones that should be advocating the most, because those are the groups of people that are typically ignoring these problems. And yeah, so that's kind of why like so much of my content has changed, because honestly, like, I didn't used to know who I was. Like, if you followed me like 8 years ago, or like a decade ago, even 5 years ago, like I didn't know who I was then. So yeah, like I have completely changed my tune on a lot of things, and I perceive the world a lot differently, and it's because I have finally figured out who I am, and I have stopped being the type of person I think other people wanted me to be, and I've started to be the type of person I actually want to be. So yeah, I am a completely different person. There's a lot of people who probably started out following my content and liked it, and then when it changed, they were like, "Oh, fuck that bitch. She sucks." And that's fine. It's like, follow what resonates with you, my friends. Like, do whatever you want, but like, when you kind of get like that epiphany moment that really makes you reevaluate the direction your life is headed and the things that you have normalized and like how shitty they actually made you feel, and you start making changes and you realize that it makes you feel better, that's really all you need to have incentive to continue doing that. And so that's kind of how I have gone about doing things the last 2 years. And I'm sure like even another 3 years from now, like my perspective is going to change again. And I think that should be also more welcomed and normal. One thing I find in the horse world is that we kind of view with shame when people admit that they've made mistakes, and when they go back on past beliefs that they've had, and when they change their tune, it's kind of looked on at shame as shame. And it's kind of made out to be like, oh, like you're a hypocrite now because you've changed your perspective, when really that should be welcomed, because it's a sign of growth. If you're perpetually staying the same, unless you were like born literally like a perfect human being who has never been which is impossible because your brain is not fully developed until you're like 25. If you aren't changing, then you're not growing. Like there's nothing wrong with changing and changing your perspectives. And like, I'm sure I'm gonna have perspective changes where I look back on stuff I'm saying now and be like, I don't agree with that. And that's okay, because that means that I learned something new and that new information came out and that I welcomed it. A lot of the stuff that I say now, if you went back to me like 5 to 10 years ago and told her, she would be like, oh my God, what an idiot. And like would be really triggered by what I'm saying now. Because I wasn't there yet when I was like however many years ago. I wasn't there yet. But now I am, and I've had a lot of ability to reflect, and I've put a lot more time into like self-development and like healing and understanding myself and kind of finding what makes me happy internally and what makes me feel calm and what makes me feel valuable and heard, and what resonates with me the most in horse training and like with what I do with my career. And I learned a lot of things along the way by making mistakes, but like there's a reason why I've changed the way that I've gone about doing things, because like I honestly felt like I was selling my soul to the devil for like the first several years that I was horse training. Especially as my perspective started to change, because I was like, I feel like I'm having to sell out on my morals. And I'm also selling out on my ability to do stuff with my own horses, and in favor of working with all these other people's horses just to like make ends meet. Um, and it didn't feel like I was being genuine to myself, and it was also really depressing, and I was so unhappy. Like honestly, there was times like, and again, people online don't necessarily know this, where like I was actively posting and I was like, just at the racetrack today, blah, 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 galloping horses, blah, 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 and I was like literally about to snap. Like I was at my wits end. I was like about to have a big old minty bee because I was not having a good time. And I was kind of jumping through the hoops that I felt that I needed to get my career ahead, and to feel better about myself and to feel valued by other people in the industry. And then I kind of hit a point where I realized that like the value system I was trying to fulfill was not my value system. So I was trying to fill a value system that I didn't even believe in myself, and that didn't make me feel good. And then I was just kind of like, screw that. I'm done with that. And then I really changed what I was doing, um, and kind of reflected on what I wanted to do differently. So I encourage everybody to do the same, because also like your body will tell you when something is not working. Like if you're chronically anxious, which like I was, and it's not that I don't get anxious anymore. That's not it at all. But if you're chronically anxious and uncomfortable, especially in specific situations, whether you realize what the cause is or not, there is something that is going on that is wrong. That if you address and deal with, you'll feel better. And I had to learn that the hard way by making myself insanely uncomfortable and unhappy for like a great deal of time. Why is my computer not charging? And shit. And yeah, it was not fun. Like it was not a good time. And I'm having a far better time now, even though like I don't think people have tried to devalue by work or like what I believe in more than they have now, even when I was being like an objectively shitty trainer, and having really stressed horses. I think that now that I have kind of accepted who I am as a person and kind of figured out what I want to do and like what my belief systems are, and kind of like put faith into that and had confidence in doing so. I think now that I have done that, and now that I'm happier with myself, and now that I have better self-esteem and more self-worth, I think now that I have done that, a lot of people are actually more triggered by my content, because I'm not reflecting the disarray and lack of self-confidence that they are feeling internally. And it bothers people more when I'm comfortable standing by what I believe in and what feels good to me, even in the absence of their validation, because they can't do that. I think I trigger people more now that I've hit a point where I feel more healed and happy with myself than I did when I was like belligerently unhappy and just kind of playing the game and like doing what I thought I needed to do. I think that I'm more triggering to people now because of the fact that I've put the work in to heal, and because of the fact that I'm happy just doing groundwork with my horses, and because of the fact that I gave Milo 2 years off of work, and it didn't like it was sad. Don't get me wrong, I didn't like it. But I just did it because it needed to be done. And like before, like in years prior, that would have been the end of the world to me. But ultimately, I kind of learned, I was like, like I had a horse die. That like my horse not being able to be ridden is like, sure, that sucks. That sucks. But like I had a horse die. So it's like it could be worse. And in learning that riding was not the be all and end all, like I learned how to be more present and happy with myself, and also take a ton of pressure off of myself. Because before I was like feeling so pressured to fulfill specific training schedules and like meet certain milestones, and it was so stressful to do. And then it also inevitably resulted in me being way too hard on my horses, because I was so desperate to get to like these goals, regard like no matter what. And it would make me so stressed that I couldn't train as well, because I was frustrated and upset with the horses when things didn't go the way that I thought they should. And that wasn't fair to them, and it also wasn't fair to myself. So I don't know. Like I've never been happier having like what a lot of people call pastor puffs, but like pastor puffs like the derogatory way, like not the way that I'd be like, oh haha, look at my pastor puffs, they're so dirty. They're like, oh, those pastor puffs, they're so dirty. Like look how scraggly and gross they are. They say it in the derogatory way. um but like I haven't been happier, and I also like that I can enjoy groundwork better more now because it's also made me a better trainer. um so yeah, I don't know. Like I don't think there's any right way to exist in the horse world or outside of it. And a lot of the ideals, especially in the horse industry, that are set to value how good of a rider or trainer someone is, a lot of those values are based in elitism. Showing is expensive. It's very expensive. Having the ability to show enough to create a show record is a privilege. Lots of people don't have that. If you're barely able to afford rent, you're probably not going to put money into going to a $1,500 a week A-rated show. Um, and anyone who is in denial of that has been born with such a silver spoon in their mouth that they cannot fathom having access to something that is so privileged. And it's not to say that the people who do those things don't work hard to do well in the show arena. That's not to invalidate that. But having that much extra money to put into showing on a regular basis is a privilege. Full stop. And to try to devalue people and make them feel like they are less good of a rider simply because they could not afford to do that is an incredibly shitty thing to do that this industry should be ashamed of, because it is rooted in elitism. It makes people who come from backgrounds where they do not have as much money feel like complete and utter shit about themselves as a rider, and oftentimes runs people out of the sport or makes them feel so jaded and unheard that they might do things to try to get attention and feel valued in the horse world that are not fair to themselves or their horses. And like, hello, I'm speaking from experience here. Like, people did this to me, like just to put this in perspective for what, so that people can understand what you're actually doing when you try to make people feel shitty about this. People made fun of me for not having a show record, and basically said that I was less of a rider for that, right? They made fun of me when my dad had literally become critically disabled from having a stroke that almost killed him, and that my family had all of their savings embezzled. We had no money. The fact that I even managed to keep my horse by working at the barn was a miracle in itself, much less being able to show. Prior to that, yeah, they had money and I was able to show, but that's because I was privileged and they had the money to pay for it. People who are literally children, odds are their parents are what helped them actually get supported enough to go and pay to go to shows. Some of those kids might work to pay their fees, but honestly, the amount of money that you need to make to attend an A-rated show when you're working part-time and going to school as a student, that's not possible for a lot of people. Um, so we need to not value people's worth as riders and trainers based off of their show records, because like, shows are literally just a venue for you to show off what you've learned outside of the show ring. That's literally all they are. If we learned how to be a good rider and a trainer in the show ring solely, there would be very little reason to practice riding outside of it. But it's merely a venue to show off your skill set if you want to. And the fact that we use that as such a measure of talent in the horse world is very, very elitist. And that needs to stop, because, again, it makes people feel shitty. There's people who use riding as like their escape from a life that is almost intolerable. There's people who go to the barn to escape trauma that is going on in their house and exist with the horses and enjoy their time, and who are just scraping by to afford that one lesson a week or that 3-day a week lease. They're putting their all into being able to afford that just so that they can go do something that they're passionate about that removes them from a situation that is demoralizing and energy sucking and really, really shitty. Um, there's people who are doing that only to then log into their Instagram and have some dickhead be like, oh, like, you don't show rated, so you suck as a rider. And it's like, these are the people that you're saying this to. And I'm being a little blunt now because I want people to, like, you should feel like shit if you've ever done this, because it's a shitty thing to do. But like, these are the people that you're saying these things to. There's a day that I distinctly remember, and I'm not going to go into detail on this. If you want more detail, you can read the book that I wrote. But there's a day that I distinctly remember where people were going off on, like, it was on Instagram and like Tumblr about like how bad of a rider and trainer I was, which, I mean, to be fair, like at the time I was doing a lot of shit wrong. And like the show record came up as like a reason of why like I just wasn't a valuable person as a rider and why like I didn't belong in the horse world, right? And this was all happening. Like, you want to know what my home life was like while this was happening? And this is why I wasn't showing. Um, like, I came home that day before I opened my inbox to read these shitty messages to my sibling being resuscitated on the floor after overdosing. And then once he was brought back to life with Narcan and I logged into my social media, I was greeted with messages shitting all over me as a rider because I didn't show and just being nasty. And these are the people that you're doing this to. That's just one example. There's people who have dealt with a lot fucking worse. So our industry needs to be less elitist. It needs to be more accessible. It needs to be less elitist. It needs to be less status driven and less like, oops, my Siri watch thinks I'm talking to her. Shut up. It needs to be less status driven. It needs to be less like selfish, and like people need to get more comfortable with admitting their privilege. Like, the amount of people who get like enraged when you call them privileged in any capacity, that's a problem in itself, because they take it as saying that they didn't work hard, when you can work hard to get where you are, but like there's certain privileges that afforded you to get there that other people don't have. Like, I'll readily admit my success in the horse world and my ability to overcome the lack of money my family had once I hit like my like tween/teen years, my ability to make the career that I had was really helped, if not entirely made, by the fact that from 4 to like 10 years old, my parents were funding my riding lessons and I was doing all this stuff and I had access to showing and riding show horses and riding often because they paid for it. There's no 4-year-old that is paying their own way into the horse world. So if you're able to start riding young before you're able to pay for it yourself, that is a privilege. And because I learned how to ride well enough back when I was young, it allowed me to get jobs and other opportunities to help pay my way through the horse world and access horses for cheap or free in order to eventually build myself up to what I am today. And yeah, it's privileged a lot. And like, again, yeah, like if my friend Amy's in the comments on Instagram, shout out to Amy. Like, a lot of the people who are competing rated, if you look at what they make, yeah, they're very privileged. Like, there was a while ago, USEF posted like the general like not client's the wrong word, the profile of like most of the people who had membership, and like the average income was like $150,000, and the average person had 2 properties. That is privilege. And to be honest, like, I don't really think that people I don't really think that people want to have to deal with some of the obstacles that certain people encounter. And it's like, if you're that desperate to not be privileged, you kind of need to like, yeah, like deprivilege yourself to experience what it would be like to have to overcome those obstacles that you haven't had to think about. Because I don't think I would be where I am today without the help that I got building myself up as a rider when I was like much younger, and like my parents paying for it. That was entirely reliant on their support, and it allowed me to get jobs and be good enough at like what I was doing to have people be willing to take me on or like let me ride their horses for free. And that was really helpful to me to like get to where I am today. And that's not to say it wasn't made harder by a lot of stuff. Like, I didn't have as easy of a path to get to where I am today as some people did, because also like even the sheer act of making this my career was an inherently risky one, because if it didn't pan out, like I would be screwed, because I had no fallback plan. I don't have family that can bail me out of situations. And that sucked, but it is what it is. And I also had to choose between like going to school and putting time into doing what I'm doing. So I've like my education, finishing that has taken way longer. And again, people have tried to shit talk me for that as well, for like not having as much of a university education. And that is also elitist, because university is expensive until it becomes free. Just like, shut up, like, it's great if you can get an education, don't get me wrong, good for you, but like anything that costs a lot of money, we need to not be assholes to people about for not being able to access when it's like literally proven that they cannot access it as easily. And that is like, it's such a pet peeve of mine. Like, and usually the people who are judging the most are people who have like at minimum, even if they paid their own way through university, which lots of them haven't, at minimum, like their rent has been paid, their car has been, they've had some level of help in most cases, because the people who haven't had that help are generally a lot less likely to judge and be shitty to people who like haven't been able to do that. But it's not easy. And I think like the nature of privilege is that you don't even realize where you have privilege unless you really put the work in to learn about what it would be like to not have those things, because you've just gotten so accustomed to having these obstacles removed from your life that you don't even think about how some people might have to encounter them. Like another great example of privilege that most of us in this chat thread probably have is just being able-bodied enough to like get up and walk around and be able to do physical labor intensive work. That is a privilege. Some people don't have that. So anyways, we just need to kind of reevaluate. And also admitting that you have privilege is not admitting that you're bad at what you do or that you didn't work hard. It's just admitting you didn't meet some of the challenges that people have. And like there's a lot of these things that I didn't think about either, because when I was younger, I used to be like, oh, pull up your bootstraps and just like work hard and like make your own opportunities. And like I got leveled by a few people who were like, I am disabled physically and I cannot do barn work. And then I was like, fuck. And it humbled me. And I was like, shit, like that's just but one example of like privilege that people have. So also being neurotypical and readily accepted by society is also a privilege, because like you don't have to mask or work really hard to like be understood or like viewed as a normal person. Yeah, so that's also why I over-explain myself a lot too. That's like a trauma response to the amount of people who are committed to misunderstanding me and just being like dicks to me for like being neurodivergent, even though like honestly, because I've reread a lot of my posts where people are like, you're saying XYZ, and I'm like, I literally didn't say that. And like this is also why most of my friends are neurodivergent, because they literally just say what they mean, and you don't have to like read between the lines of context and like embellish what they're actually telling you to try to get to like the true nature of what they're trying to say. So it's a lot easier when people just say what they mean, even if sometimes you don't want to hear what they have to say, and it kind of sucks to hear, why is my charger not working? Even if that happens, like I'd rather have people who are honest with me and like say how it is, even if I don't like to hear it, than people who withhold that context from me. So I don't know. But yeah, like we need to make the horse world so much more accessible and like understanding of everybody, because it's not. And no worries to the person. Don't apologize for dominating the chat on YouTube, as you should, but yeah, because we erase a lot of marginalized groups. We really do. And that shouldn't be the case. Because also like the last thing I'm going to say before I kind of close out this chat is something that I've noticed is like the idea of like allowing marginalized groups to be more centered in the horse world. That idea in itself makes people who are from groups that are well represented, not stigmatized, and not experiencing any level of oppression. The idea of making other minority groups feel more represented to them feels like oppression, because they're not as centered. For example, the other day I saw a post that was talking about a woman who was like one of the first really successful Black polo players. Go into the comments and a bunch of people are like, why are you making this about race? It's not about race. Like race doesn't, like we're all the same. And like people being like, why does her race matter? And like just kind of being dicks about it. And it's like, if race didn't matter, why is she the first one? Riddle me that. And then people were implying that it's just because other people don't work as hard. And it's literally always all white people saying this, mind you. So, like, it's just like people who are so privileged and have been represented well their whole life are always the ones that feel the most attacked by other people starting to be centered more instead of entirely erased. They feel attacked by that. And they're like, why does it have to be made about race? Why do we have to like center these identities that have been completely erased from society? And the answer is because they have been erased. We wouldn't have to put so much effort into centering people and talking about them if they hadn't been erased and if they hadn't had so many barriers preventing them from being able to be their authentic selves in the public eye without problem. But they have been. And like I can also admit, like growing up, I really don't remember any magazine publications and any like brands that had people of color as their models. All of the writers that I grew up watching when I was young were white, and it literally didn't even cross my mind until quite some time that that was even weird. It didn't even cross my mind that there is so few models of color in the horse industry, and it's really only been like the last 5 years that there's been more diversity increasing in those sections. And for people who aren't from those groups and who have always been well represented, they don't even notice those things. They don't even notice the fact that other groups of people aren't being represented because it's never been them. So the fact that people are not only aware of the fact that they're not being centered as much when the circle opens to include everybody and not just centering them, the fact that that makes them feel shitty is like a very clear sign that if they were the ones actually being oppressed, they would freak out because they can't even handle not being the center of the universe and having to like share the spotlight with other people who've never been able to have a seat at the table. Um, so just food for thought. Um, Also, like if you're not from a marginalized group, you literally have no business talking about what they do or don't experience, especially when it comes to oppression. So just saying. But yeah, anyways, I'm gonna close off this chat because I have to go feed my horses and do errands and stuff. But yeah, I will always rally harder for people who don't get seen or discussed or heard in society. And if you didn't watch this whole thing from the beginning, it's going to be saved on my channel so you can watch it after if you would like. And also on like Instagram and whatnot. But like, yeah, I care more about using my platform to amplify voices that are traditionally misunderstood and not heard. And not understood because they don't get the privilege of just getting to walk in a room and feel comfortable and feel seen and heard and understood. Whereas the people who do get that comfort, they don't need to be made more comfortable than they are. In fact, they probably should experience a little bit of discomfort to get comfortable sharing the spotlight with people who have never been allowed to be a part of it. And I am in a position of privilege as like a white passing biracial horse girl because like I can also guarantee that if I was less white passing, I probably would have gotten less opportunities because people would have had a different viewpoint of me and I wouldn't have been as normal and accepted in the horse world. My whiteness has been a privilege that has brought me like a lack of racism because people are also more comfortable being openly racist in front of me because they think that I'm just another white person who will listen to it and not say anything. And also that aspect of it has also been really telling to me because it speaks for how many people don't call that behavior out when they see it. So if you want to be an advocate, it can start with literally checking your friends or your trainers or people you're around when they're saying shitty things and putting them in their place. And it's really uncomfortable to do. But it gets more comfortable, I promise. It does. The more you do it, it gets more comfortable. And also, ultimately, it's kind of like taking out the trash because you don't want to be aligning with people that have really intolerant views, anyways, if you don't want to be that type of person. So you're going to just make your circle higher quality if you lose those people. But realistically, reasonable people who actually don't want to hurt other people should be willing to be checked about those types of things without there being an issue. So So yeah, just something to think about. That is like one of the best things you can do as a person of privilege is to shut shit down. I bet and the same goes for like misogyny and shit. Like male equestrians or anyone that is listening to someone being like shit talked because she's a woman, they're in a position of power to shut that shit down. Or even if there's no women present, if they're listening to their friends say misogynistic bullshit, they can call them out and be like, no, don't do that. And shut it down. Like you don't have to make like a entire thing about it, like where it's like a production, but you should say something and like because apathy makes those people comfortable. If everyone who said shitty, intolerant bullshit got called out on it, they would not be comfortable saying it all the time. Um, and I understand that like I spend most of my time with horse people and that's like this circle that I'm most part of, but like the level of elitism and racism and just general intolerance in this industry seems to be much more concentrated than what I have heard about and noticed in a lot of other areas. And it honestly tracks because of how rich and white the sport is. Especially in like English sports like show jumping and hunter jump like and hunters and dressage and whatnot. So in order to make these changes, people need to be made uncomfortable. No one's entitled to feeling comfortable at the expense of like marginalizing other people. And like, if it causes you discomfort to hear about how like white people as a whole have like oppressed lots of different races, and it doesn't matter if you're not personally part of it, it's still ongoing, and like the denial and like apathy promotes it. If it makes you uncomfortable to hear that, just consider how uncomfortable it would be to like actively be oppressed just for being who you are, because like you can't like peel your skin off and remove your skin and just like have that not play a factor in how people perceive you and judge you. And if you even if you could, they'd see like your muscular system being present, and they'd be like, "Whoa, what the fuck is that?" And you'd still get judged for your skin. So yeah, it's just something to consider, and it's also important to hear other perspectives and like hear different voices and amplify those voices, and also just use your voice to shut down behavior that isn't beneficial to the industry as a whole. Um, because yeah, it needs to change, and like our industry is really tradition based and it's really far behind in changing on a lot of these different aspects. And if you take the time to talk to people who are not white passing or who are from like other marginalized groups, they'll tell you how difficult it can be to exist in the show world just as a regular person without at least being met with microaggressions. So I would encourage people to kind of listen to those perspectives, because it'll give you a different way of thinking about things that like you as a person who might not be from those groups never has to think about, because you just get to walk around comfortably without those types of things happening. And also learning what microaggressions are and what they sound like for specific things, because then if you hear them, you could be like, hey, like that's not cool, don't say that. Because there's certain things that people don't even necessarily clock as being racist if they're not from the racial group that it's targeted at. And that can just come from like ignorance and not knowing. So I don't know. What I would hope to do with my platform is just inspire other people to say things and speak out against shit that they don't like and get comfortable doing so, because also the more people who do it, the more comfortable it gets for everybody. Less risk involved if there's a big group of people saying the same types of things and no longer tolerating the same type of behavior. So he like we can like make a big difference just by doing that. Anyways, to the person asking if I have seen Jason Palmer, no, I don't. But I'm down for anyone who's like a pro-Palestine advocate and education advocate. And also for anyone who's annoyed about my pro-Palestine posts, they're not going to stop. They're just going to get more frequent the longer this goes on. So like probably should unfollow me if that's the case. But yeah, actually, this kind of ties into what I was saying about race too. And I just want to say this so people can hopefully understand where I'm coming from. Other than like the huge humanitarian crisis that is ongoing in multiple different countries now that are like experiencing genocide, other than like that is horrific, and that is like the very biggest part about talking about these things. But something that has made me viscerally uncomfortable about being involved in the horse world now is how many people openly support those things happening. Because to me, that translates as those people during the slave trade would have been on the side of the plantation owners. So those people are not on my side. Like, I would have gotten executed back in the day if I was born as a biracial person, because that was viewed as like completely not okay. So when I see people supporting the modern day versions of those intolerant views, I clock it as that person is actually not on my side. They're only on my side now that it's socially acceptable to like people who are biracial, and it's socially acceptable to be really against slavery and segregation. They're only on my side now because it is comfortable to do so. But back in the day when all of these horrors were ongoing and when they were not illegal, it would not have been acceptable to go against the grain and speak out. It was very much not acceptable. So in times where injustice is being enabled, speaking out against it is never going to be comfortable. And if you cannot do it when it is uncomfortable, and you can only do it when it is becoming the trend and popular thing to do, you're not actually on the side of like changing it, because it's never going to be comfortable to go against something that's really accepted. But that has honestly made me so uncomfortable, and it actually makes me really mad to see the number of people who either hit up my inbox and are telling me that I shouldn't be talking about certain things and I should stop posting, threatening to unfollow me, which is just like, fucking unfollow me. Don't tell me. I don't care. I don't know who you are. Leave, you know? But they or saying like really nasty, disgusting, racist shit on my posts about that. It's made me very uncomfortable, because some of the accounts that have done this have been people that I recognize their handles because they have come across as generally nice, normal people before that. And then it just kind of reiterates the fact that they're only just being nice and normal to me because I'm just like white enough for them to accept. So it makes me really uncomfortable. So also I'm doubling down on like my whole calling out the racism of the horse world thing on an even greater scale, because like a lot of racists are just going full mask off now because there's stuff happening to people of color, and they're like, I don't care. Like they hold up a color swatch and they're just like, oh, sorry, like they're just below like the off-white eggshell color, so like I can't give a shit about what happens to them now. That's essentially what it is. So yeah, it's disappointing to say the least. And I get a lot of that shit on my posts and in my inbox, and also just people saying really gross stuff just on purpose to like try and trigger me. And I've just like, I started blocking everyone. Like usually I try to give people a chance, but it's like, if you're just going to be belligerently racist in my DMs or in the comment section, like, no. And I've also started reporting people to Safe Sport for that shit, because it's like, no, we're not going to do that. But yeah, like, yeah, what someone said in the YouTube chat too is that you need to be anti-racist. It's not just not racist, which is important. Like, not participating in racism yourself is not even the bare minimum. That's just like what should be the default. But since racism still exists, we need to be anti-racist. And that's also why people say that race matters, and why it can't be this whole I don't see color bullshit, because like other people do. And until it stops being an issue where racism exists, we can't pull that shit, because it's a problem. Not seeing color is pretending to ignore the issue in front of you, and that's not fair to the people who are directly experiencing the issue. So anyways, I got to go take care of my horses. Thank you everyone for listening. These will be up on my Instagram and my YouTube if you want to watch from the beginning. But I appreciate people who tune in on these things, because I think they're important topics, and it just gives me more time to kind of unpack my thoughts. So anyways, see you later, guys, and have a nice day, everybody. And yeah, don't forget to call out your local racist and make sure they're not comfortable, because people shouldn't be comfortable. Okay, bye.